Hi everybody, welcome back to another Sippin' on Sunshine video. We are on video number 4. Today we're going to be working on the Sky, Bluebird, Sun Hat, and Life is a Picnic blocks. I have all my materials cut and prepped and in their bags along with batting. When you measure your batting, add an inch to the finished block size. For example, the Sun Hat block finishes at 6.5 inches square. Cut your batting at 7.5 inches square and you'll be good to go. I also have all my threads ready, paper tape, scissors, everything's in my fabric wrap rope bowl. I have a video for that linked below. Got my needle minder and my instructions. We're going to head over to the machine and get started. I'm on a baby lock meridian. I've got my files on USB, my instructions, my folding metal book stand, my needle minder. We're going to be working on these blocks with the background quilting. And since we've already done a few videos, I'm going to move through the background quilting part a little bit faster. We need KDQ 530 Weather 7 6x8. KDQ 530 Weather 7. Then we need to find the 6x8 design. And then we'll load our embroidery file on top of that. 6x8. We hit set. We hit add. And then we need to find our sky design. 6x10 sky right there. Go ahead and hit set in embroidery. I already have my linen color on my machine. I have an 8x12 hoop on my machine, light mesh cutaway in the hoop, and I'm going to go through these steps all together. Batting placement, tack down, fabric placement, tack down, and quilting. If you need to see it slower, go to the earlier videos in the series, but we've done this before. I want to spend more time on the blocks. Let's go ahead and work up through our background quilting. The background quilting has stitched out. This is beautiful background quilting. It's almost a shame to cover it up. We're going to switch to the color Mercury and stitch out the cloud base placement lines. We're going to work with flexi foam for this block. Now, my piece is cut smaller because it's a piece of scrap. I pulled it out of my bag of flexi foam. You want to make sure to cover the placement lines and you want to tape this down because it's squishy and puffy. You don't want it moving while you're doing your tack down lines. So I know I have mine down at an angle. If you've cut yours according to the instructions, I think you can lay it down straight. But my piece is short. Like I said, I pulled it out of the scrap pile, but it's still going to work. Once you have this taped into place, you're going to stitch the tack down. I recommend sitting and watching whenever you're using something like flexi foam. I'm sure you saw the presser foot catch on the tape. I tend to reuse my tape. It wasn't sticky enough. It came right up. And my piece of flexi foam is smaller than it says to cut in the instructions because I grabbed the scrap piece. You want to go ahead and remove any tape. If any of it is inside the stitch line, you can pick it out, but if it becomes difficult to get out, just leave it because we're going to cover it. You're never going to see it. Then you want to trim everything that's outside of the cloud stitch line. So you'll have 3 puffy clouds left. Here's what that looks like after everything is trimmed. Hey everybody, the next step is to actually stitch out the cloud fabric placement line, which I completely forgot to do, but it works out okay anyway. Go ahead and stitch out your cloud placement line. You've got your cloud fabric. It should have fusible on the back. You want to completely cover those flexi foam clouds and then tape that into place. I'm going to pull off some new tape and make sure I've got this nice and secure. I went ahead and added 2 long pieces on both sides. The next thing we're going to do is stitch the cloud tack down line. These are all tacked down. You want to go ahead, remove your tape, trim away the outside fabric, and then we're going to stitch the cloud satin outlines, and they also have a little swirl that's going to stitch out. Everything is trimmed. We're ready to stitch the cloud satin outlines. This is still in the color Mercury. Once the satin stitch has stitched out, it has us switching to the color Grotto Blue. This is the color I have for Grotto Blue, and we're going to stitch out the clouds details. It's going to stitch kind of down the middle of the satin stitching. Switch to the color Buttercup, and we're going to stitch out the placement line for the sun felt. Placement lines are all stitched out. We want to cover that with our felt and add some tape. Once you've got that taped into place, it's going to stitch tack down and the decorative fill. If you look at your machine, you'll see it almost kind of looks like plaid or lace or something. It looks really pretty. I want to make sure that's taped into place, and I'm going to keep an eye on that since not only it's doing the tack down, but it's also doing that decorative fill. We won't be trimming until after all of that stitching is done. That's all stitched out. We've got to cut away everything that's outside of those stitching lines. The next thing that's stitching out is the butterfly trail detail in the color Hickory. I'm actually going to stitch that out before I get this trimmed. There's plenty of space. It's going to go right there. I'm going to switch to Hickory and stitch out the butterfly trail. If you're using the embellishment kit, that's it for this block. If you don't have the embellishment kit, the next steps are right here to stitch out the butterfly. You've got the colors aloe, clover, aloe, and then hickory, so you would stitch that out and be done. What I'm going to do is take this off my machine, I'm going to set it aside, and then we're going to work on the bird block. While the background quilting is stitching or any other long stitch out is going on, I'm going to trim the sun. Next, we're going to work on the Bluebird block. I'm really excited to make this. Love birds. We've got lots of bird feeders here. This is going to be a fun one to make. We need to find KDQ 528 Insect 7 6x6 design. Here's my 6x6. I'm going to go ahead and set that, and then we'll add our Bluebird design. You can see the Bluebird load sideways. It doesn't matter, the background quilting is not directional. We want to start with the color Buttercup. I'm going to go ahead and put that on my machine, and I'm going to work up through the background quilting. The quilting is done. Here's how far I got trimming the sun. I'm taking my time with this one, and I'm using the snips. I'm almost going one little snip at a time next to it, so it's slow going. But this block is going to have a really long stitch out in a minute, so you can leave this to do while you're working on your bird block. You're going to need to take your hoop off the machine. We're going to switch to the water-soluble thread, and it says to place it in the top and in the bobbin. This is the brand that I'm using. It works really well. I have a bobbin for it, and I put a little W on it, and I keep the two of these in a plastic bag so I don't accidentally mix them up with regular thread. Once you've got your water-soluble thread in your bobbin and top thread, we're going to stitch out the leaves 1 placement lines. These are really hard to see. We've got one here, and one up here. It says to place the leaves 1 dark green felt covering those placement lines. That's the smaller piece of felt. It'll cover. I was worried it wasn't going to be big enough, but I did cut according to the instructions. I'm going to get a piece of tape, and then we're going to stitch out the leaves 1 tack down lines. We need to trim away everything outside of the tack down line. As you can see, you've got 3 tiny little leaves. You're going to end up with a nice piece of leftover felt. I managed to get the sun trimmed. Now I can take this out of the hoop and set it aside. I forgot to mention, right now I'm working in an 8x8 hoop. These are all trimmed. Before we go to the next step, change out your bobbin thread. You want to put your regular bobbin thread back on, and we're going to change the top thread to the color Fox. I'll show you that in a moment. I've got my regular bobbin thread in. This is the color I'm using for the color Fox. We're going to stitch out the branch fill. It's a long stitch out, so if you haven't trimmed your sun, you can trim your sun. You can have another project handy. Go ahead and switch your thread and stitch out the branch. Once your branch has stitched out, we're going to switch to butter, and we're going to stitch out the back leg fill. Once the little leg has stitched, we're going to switch to the color Ocean, and we're going to stitch out the bird body placement line. If you're working with the embellishment kit, we're using the micro velvet for this. We're going to cover the placement line. Your micro velvet has a nap. When you brush it the wrong way, it looks like that, and then you brush it the right way and it smooths out really nice. So you want it laying out, so when you brush it down, the bird head is there, the bird feet are there, brushed out really nice. Make sure you're covering that placement line, and then we're going to add tape and stitch the tack down. You want to trim away everything that's outside of the tack down line. The micro velvet will fuzz. You'll probably have to use a piece of tape to get up some of the lint. You're going to have a nice piece left over. You can set that aside for other projects. Once you've got that trimmed, you can put your hoop back on the machine, and we're going to stitch out the body decorative outline. Next, we're going to stitch out the wing tip placement line. You want to grab your wing tip fabric. It says to place it right side up. It's a solid, and my guess is this is the only time we use this scrap because I didn't cut it. I just threw the whole thing in the bag. Make sure it covers the placement line. I'm going to add a piece of tape, but I'm not going to tape on the velvet. I'm going to stitch the tack down and then trim away everything outside the tack down line. Once you've got that trimmed, you're going to stitch out the wing tip decorative outline. That's all stitched out. We're going to switch to the color Mercury and stitch out the upper wing and face placement lines. We want to cover the placement lines with the upper wing and face felt. Looks like I didn't cut this either. This might be the only place where we use this felt. Go ahead and make sure that's covered, which clearly it is. I'm going to add tape, and we're going to stitch the tack down, and then you want to trim everything that's outside the tack down line. Once you've got the felt trimmed, you're ready to stitch out the upper wing and face decorative outlines. Next, we're going to switch to the color Butter. We're going to stitch out the front leg and the beak fill. Once that's stitched out, you want to change the top and the bobbin to the water-soluble thread. Got my water-soluble thread in the bobbin and the top. We're going to stitch out the leaves to placement lines. Now we have to play the game Find the Placement Lines. They're really hard to see with the water-soluble thread. I'm probably going to have to take this over to the table. Make sure I get everything covered. This is the darker felt, so you're going to want to cover the placement lines, get it taped in place, and then stitch the tack down. I think I have everything covered. We're going to find out. Let's stitch our tack down. I've got everything tacked down. You want to go ahead and trim everything outside of the lines, so you're going to have 6 leaves and a nice piece of leftover felt. After you've trimmed your leaves, make sure to get the water-soluble bobbin out and your regular bobbin thread back in your machine. After you've got your bobbin thread switched out, you want to grab color Aloe. This is the color I'm using for Aloe. We're going to stitch out the leaves detail. A couple more things to stitch out. We're going to use the color Hickory to stitch out the bird's eye, and then switch to Linen and stitch out the eye and body details. I'll go ahead and film those two together. After that stitch is out, there's going to be a little line up at the top of the block. You don't need to stitch that. You can ignore that. The linen is going to be the last thing that you stitch on your machine. Again, your machine's probably going to show a little line to stitch there. You can skip that. We're all done with the bird block. What you want to do next is dissolve your water-soluble thread. You can use a craft brush, a wet Kleenex, a wet swab, or if you don't want to get it wet, you can unpick it. You can use a seam ripper. It even says that in the instructions. I love the way it turned out. Looks like you might have some jump threads, so check for jump threads. I'm going to get this out of the hoop because I'm going to use the same hoop for the sun hat. It looks like our background quilting is 6.5 inches square, so my 8x8 hoop will be perfect. Let's bring up our quilting for our sun hat. We need KDQ 530 Weather 7 6x6. KDQ 530 Weather 7, then we need to find the 6x6 right here, and then we need to go ahead and add the sun hat embroidery on top of that. We're good to go. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing and work all the way through the background quilting, and we're doing that with the color Mercury. It's already on my machine. Quilting has stitched out. We're going to switch to the color Mocha, and we're going to stitch out the placement line for our hat. If you're using the embellishment kit, we're using that new woven look embroidery leather, and embroidery leather is not animal leather, it's a PVC product. We're going to go ahead and cover the placement line, add a piece of tape, and then we're going to stitch the tack down. Once that's tacked down, go ahead and trim away everything outside the tack down line. We need to switch to the color Fox, and we're going to stitch out the hat detail. We're going to switch to Mocha and stitch out the hat decorative outline. Going to switch to the color Aloe. We need to stitch out the leaves fill. Next up is the color Monarch. We're going to stitch out the flower 1 placement line. For flower 1, we've got felt. You want to cover the placement line, stitch the tack down, trim outside the tack down, and then stitch out the decorative outline. I'm going to go ahead and run all of that together. It's the same as we've been doing. The decorative outline is all stitched out. The next 2 steps I'm going to go ahead and run together. We're going to switch to Tango and stitch out the flower 1 inner petals fill, and then Hickory and stitch out the flower 1 centers fill. Switch to Linen. We're going to stitch out the flower 2 placement line. Flower 2 has the micro velvet. So when you brush it the one way, it looks wrong, and you brush it down the other way, it looks right. It's nice and smooth. We just did that with the bird block. We're going to go ahead and cover that placement line, tape it in place, stitch the tack down, and then trim everything that's outside of the tack down line. I'm sure you saw me stop that. This is sliding right along that embroidery leather underneath. It's really slick. Make sure you tape that well. I'm going to go ahead and trim outside the tack down. There is no detail stitching for this flower, so take some extra time with your trimming. That's all trimmed. You want to switch to the color Cappuccino, and we're going to stitch out the flower 2 center fill. That's the last thing to stitch for this block. This block is done. I'm going to get it out of the hoop and set it aside, and we're going to stitch out Life is a Picnic. We're on our last block to stitch out for today, and then we'll do all the block trimming. We're going to stitch out the Life is a Picnic. We need to pull up our background quilting KDQ 530 Weather 7 6x10. Then we add our block. Put the color Linen on your machine. I'm going to run everything up through the background quilting. The quilting has stitched out. We're going to switch to the color Monarch, and we're going to stitch out the Kite A placement line. You want to grab your Kite A fabric, cover the placement line, stitch out the tack down, and trim. I've got that trimmed. I'm going to put this back on my machine, stitch out the Kite B placement line, then I'll place my Kite B fabric, stitch the tack down, and trim. Once that's trimmed, you're going to stitch out the Kite A satin outline, still with the color Monarch. Next, we're going to switch to Grotto Blue and stitch out the Kite B satin outline. Next, we're going to switch to the color Mocha and stitch out the Kite String Fill and the Frame Satin Outline. That's all stitched out. We're going to put in our water-soluble top thread and bobbin thread again. Once you've got your water-soluble top and bobbin thread, we're going to go ahead and stitch out the kite tails. There's going to be 4 of those. It's going to be the placement line for our felt. Placement lines are all stitched out, and we're going to tack these down with the water-soluble thread. It has us doing these one at a time. I'm going to see if all the felt will fit at the same time. Hi everybody, everything does fit. You just have to trim the green and the red, make them a little bit smaller. Be careful with your placement and add tape on both sides to keep everything nice and secure. I've got everything taped. It looks like it's actually going to start down here. So it's going to tack down this one, and if you're following the instructions, tack down, trim. And then you would place the green, tack down, trim. And then you would place both the yellows, tack down and trim. I'm going to move through all the tack downs at once. I am going to sit here and watch it and make sure nothing gets caught between the felt. That worked out great. Now they're all tacked down. I can take away all the tape and trim them all at the same time. We need to switch out our bobbin thread for our regular thread, and then we're going to put the color Buttercup on our machine for the next step. I have my regular bobbin thread back in my machine. Buttercup is loaded, and we're going to stitch out the kite tails 1 and 4 center fills. Those have stitched out. We're going to switch to Monarch, and we're going to stitch out the center fill for the red kite tail, and then we're going to switch to Clover and stitch out the center fill for the green kite tail. I'm going to go ahead and run those steps together. Next we want to get the color Tango on our machine, and we're going to stitch out the words Life and Picnic. Next, we're going to switch to Grotto Blue, and we're going to stitch out the rest of the text for this block. The block is all stitched out. Looks like there's a couple of jump threads with the blue lettering. I'm going to take care of that, and then we'll head over to the table and trim our blocks. It's time to trim our blocks. 3 of them are really straightforward, and we went through how to use the orange pop rulers last time. The sky block, we're going to trim 6.5 by 8.5, and there is a 6.5 by 8.5 rectangle orange pop ruler. Let's go ahead and trim that block. Both the Bluebird and the Sun Hat are going to trim to 6.5 inches square. I'm going to use the 6.5 square and the 8.5 square to give my hands a little more room. Looks like I've got 1 jump thread there I've got to cut. The Life is a Picnic block is an odd size, and we did this on the last video where they show you how to trim with 2 different sizes of orange pop rulers. So today I'm going to show you how to trim this with regular rulers in case you don't have the orange pop rulers. Most quilters have a 6.5 by 12.5 inch ruler. It's fairly standard. What I would do is line it up, and you can kind of feel the threads with your fingernail or with your finger. Make sure you get that nice and centered. And if you see thread here and then don't see thread there, then you know it's crooked. Try to get it as straight as possible. I'm going to place the ruler once and then trim both of these sides. If all you have is a skinny ruler, you can use that too and trim one side at a time. I'm going to go ahead and hold that. I'm going to keep my hand on this, spin around, and I'm going to trim the other side. So my 2 sides are trimmed. Now, I happen to have a ruler that's 8.5 inches wide, which would take care of these 2 sides, but if you don't, if you just have 1 ruler, line up, make sure you've got a straight edge here, and then you're lining up right along that stitching. So the stitching is your guide. You don't always have to have the exact right size ruler. Any ruler will work. We only have 1 more cut to make on this one. And then I'll measure it and we'll see how it came out cutting with the regular ruler. So I should have a straight edge there, straight there, it looks good. And then I need to find the thread, and I want to cut right on the thread. You could also measure it right now from the part that's off camera, but I'm going to cut it. I'm going to measure after. We'll see how I do. Let's go ahead and measure this. There's our 6.5. And let's slide it this way. Here's the 1/2 inch marks going that direction so I can read my 1/2 inch. Line it up along the top. That came out just the right size, 6.5 by 10.5. Don't forget, for your Life is a Picnic block, you're going to dissolve the water-soluble thread or snippet. I'm going to go ahead and do that off camera so I can finish the video. I did dissolve it for the bird block. It dried really nice. By dissolving the thread, what it does is it allows these leaves to lift up off the block and give that 3D effect. So when you dissolve or trim the thread here, the little kite tails are going to lift up and you'll have a 3D effect for this block. Really quick, here's what it looks like. It's wet. See how these lift up? All I did was spray it with water, gave it about 15 seconds. They've lifted up, all the water-soluble thread has dissolved. I'm going to set this aside to dry. Let's get a look at all of our blocks and talk about what we're going to do next week. We've got all of our blocks here. They came out great. As far as putting on the butterfly button, I'm going to do all the embellishments at the end. We've got our sky, bluebird, sun hat, and Life is a Picnic. Next week will be video number 5. We're going to work on the flowers 1, 2, and 3, the butterfly, and the strawberries because I forgot to do that in week number 3. Thank you so much for joining me for video number 4 in the Sippin' on Sunshine quilt along. I'll be back next week for the other blocks. See you next time.